SaMD was started quite a long time ago by Jouke Wilson with the intention to create a regulatory startup group for anyone who is in the field of SaMD, wants to get information, and it should be an open platform. Anyone can join. Anyone who's interested in presenting can send out a message and can ask to present during these sessions. And we'll try to address as many startup or software related topics as we can. So every time we'll try to find a topic that's interesting to people. And today, change management is the setup. So can we go to the next slide? Is it me, I guess? Wait, I'm actually on the wrong screen. There we go. The goal, again, build a network of industry experts with a willingness to help each other and also discuss best practices, problems, and at the end of the day, try to make the regulations more transparent. Let's see, I think I'm not the one sharing, right? I am actually, but give me 1 second. I'm not sure why I'm struggling. It's just not responding. There we go. So the resources for anyone who's interested, we have a YouTube channel where you can watch the latest recordings and you can look back at all the webinars that have taken place. You can see the trust pilot reviews, and there's also the Open Regulatory Slack channel that's hosted through Open Regulatory. If you're interested in joining the Slack channel, there's, I think right now, more than 1,200 SaMD representatives in there from a regulatory perspective. People will regularly ask questions to each other, and it's just a good way to get more information from Doorn. So the agenda for today, we have 3 sessions, and we'll kick off with a session by Scarlett, by Stephen Byrne, who will give us a bit of an explanation from a change management perspective from the body side. Then Monique is going to pick up and dive into how change management is done within software as a medical device manufacturers. And I'll try to touch a little bit on the relationship between changes and also UDIDIs, basic UDIDIs, best practices, what that looks like, and how you connect changes to those aspects. And I think it's interesting topic because it's also changing quite fast. So we've seen from the MDD to the MDR, we've seen quite some changes being implemented into the legislation directly. And on top of that, we also see now with the simplification proposal that there's additional changes coming up, amongst which also I think we've seen it already in the United States, the predetermined changes that will be implemented straight into the IVDR. So those are exciting developments to watch. If we have some time left at the end, I can show you what's the exact fact coming out of the MDR simplification proposal, and also touch a little bit upon the legislation right now on what's in the MDR and the IV with regards to change management. But without further ado, I think it's good to start the session by giving the hands up to Stephen. So feel free to take over, Stephen, if you can.
Thank you very much. Let's get the slides up. Hopefully you should start seeing my screen now. Okay, so to start off then, I'll just do a quick introduction of who we are. So Scarlett is a notified body. We specialize in AI as a medical device, software as a medical device. We certify across a number of ranges of regions. So we started off in the EU and the UK. We've now got MDSAP and FDA. We're part of their third-party review organization program, so we can do 510K as well. For myself, principal SaMD expert. So I've done background in software development, some medical device, software in a medical device, software as a medical device, and a little bit of AI as a medical device before I joined Scarlett as well. So yeah, somewhat familiar with change management, especially on the technical software side of things. What I'll talk about today is, the change management from the notified body's perspective. So within that, I'll talk about what we expect to see within the initial submission for EU MDR. That's going to cover what we'll be looking for in terms of planning for changes coming up. I'll go through our change request process a bit and what the different pathways are, whether it's non-substantial or substantial. I'll talk a little bit about some of the ongoing changes as well in that area. And what I'll talk about as well is what we look for in surveillance audit. So for those non-substantial changes where they're going to be caught within surveillance after the fact, what we actually look for and how you can prepare in advance for that. And I'll just finish off with a quick demo of our web app. So we've actually do our change notifications through a web portal. So I'll just give you a quick 2-minute demo on what that looks like within our platform. So to start off with initial submission, that's obviously where you're producing your processes and documentation to show how you're going to do changes in the future. Firstly, with that, we look at what your software development lifecycle processes and planning documents are. So within your QMS and within your technical documentation, it's really important to make sure that you're really calling out, what your plans are going to be, how you're going to approach changes. If you don't have those, you're likely to get queries or requests for information during the assessment process. So just to dive in a little bit to the detail of exactly what we look for, it's nothing that's rocket science. It is really just, we want to see best practice software development. So first of all, software change management. That can be as simple as how you are managing the version controls of your software, how you're tagging things for releases. Again, you don't need to reinvent the wheel here. A lot of people are reliant on real state-of-the-art stuff like Git that's been around for years. So there's nothing too special we need there. It's just documentation of how you do it. Again, release management is another important thing. So when you're going to do release or changes, how you manage the releases, so that goes from your documentation in terms of the evidence of your re-verification, the tagging of the release, how you actually build that release, and then how you distribute and deploy that to the market. So having plans and procedures around that is quite important. And then when we look at sort of the minor changes, we look at how you do your software problem resolution, because obviously this is going to spin out a lot of, let's say, bug fixes and minor changes. So having a process for being able to triage the information that's coming in from the field and being able to then have structured ways of getting that to the market and the cadence at which you do so. Similar to that as well is the vulnerability monitoring and patching from a security perspective. So that, again, it sort of fits in with your problem resolution, looking at more at the security side of things though. The other things we look for changes are the risk impact. So doing risk impact assessment on any changes that you're making. And on the back of that then is having a proper process for change classification and sort of the change procedures around that. So again, being able to determine yourself what's a non-substantial change and what's a substantial change. The other angle I'll add on this as well is just on AI lifecycle management. We're seeing a lot of stuff coming in now, which is software as a medical device. It's got some sort of LLM or machine learning component. So when you're looking at changes for those kind of devices, there's additional processes and documentation we'd expect to see. So that can be the model version control. So how do you know what version you're on at the moment, making sure that that's clear within all your data, any data you're collecting about your AI model, making sure that you're able to pin that back to the version that was live at the time. Operational monitoring is an important thing when it comes to the change management, because that's one of the things that's going to trigger it, is if you're starting to see, again, functional issues, performance issues, security issues. Again, similar to your sort of problem resolution processes, is are you collecting information about your AI model? And then also real world performance evaluation. So being able to notice if your model is starting to drift and it's going to require a change because of a need for retraining and benchmarking the performance. We also look at what you're doing revalidation procedures. So how you're retraining your model, you're revalidating that against performance criteria, and then basically validating that model is ready to be launched to the market again. And then the deployment procedures to get that to the market. And then the final one is if you are using third-party LLMs or anything that's requiring third-party soup within your stack, if those models are depreciating under your nose, as they do with, let's say, the likes of ChatGPT and Claude at the moment, that they're constantly upgrading these models, being able to shift your model sitting on top of that before that deprecates, and having very robust change management processes for AIs is quite important because of the landscape at the moment is changing so much. Yeah, so that's all about the initial submission. What I'll do now is talk a little bit about how we do change requests and what the flow is. This is quite standard. It's pretty much applicable for all notified bodies. So what we look at then, first of all, is if I work left to right here, you come up with a planned change. It's on you as the manufacturer to determine if that is substantial or not, and then you decide on the path down the road. So you either take the non-substantial route. So for non-substantial changes, you're able to implement that change straight away. And then what we do is we assess that decision, and we also assess the documentation for that change during the surveillance audit, which is once a year. The other pathway is if you have got a substantial change, you have to hold fire on that change until we approve it. So what you do in that case is you notify us, and I'll get onto this in a couple of slides time, but we then have different ways to be able to assess that. And depending on the scope of the change, size of the change, the risk associated with it, we can either push that through quite quickly, or we have to do some sort of partial or full assessment. But again, with this, it's very important to try and keep us in the loop as well. One of the things we really push for is constant engagement. So within our setup, if you join Scarlett as a customer, you get an account manager. So you do like regular check-ins every 2 weeks or so. So giving us a heads up about what changes you're planning and whether they're going to be substantial or not is quite important, because then we can actually, we can free up some assessment resource to make sure that when that comes in, we're ready to triage it and act on it as quickly as possible. Again, it's all about trying to reduce the burden on you getting to market. So if I take a look at the non-substantial changes first, like what exactly do we look for in an audit? It's quite straightforward at the top level. Is like, we really want to make sure that you have evidence that you followed your procedures. So in the initial submission, you've produced a lot of documentation to say how exactly it is you're going to manage changes. We really at this step are checking, have you followed those procedures? Have you kept your technical documentation and your QMS up to date? So the kind of things we look for is, first of all, is the rationale behind the non-substantial determination. So were you right in the fact that this is non-substantial, or do we think it should have been substantial and you should have told us about it sooner? So we can iterate on that as well and share some learnings. We want to see the change records, so where it's being requested, the review approval process for that, and then the documentation that's gone with every change. So that's really more from a QM perspective. Are you following a proper change request and approval process? We want to see if your risk management's been updated. Have you incorporated the new changes and considered the impact on safety and performance? If there's any testing that was required for changes, where it's been able to pull up the regression test evidence for that, and as well as that, then your software configuration management, being able to see the changes, the control changes within your Git repo or whatever you're storing your software. And then, do you have release documentation for everything that you've pushed to the market over the course of the year? So again, it's very much mirroring what you're looking at in your initial submission. It's just showing the evidence that you have followed your procedures and you've kept your documentation up to date. And again, this doesn't need to be, massive amounts of novel documents like War and Peace. It just needs to be concrete evidence that's available at the time of the audit. To look down at more the substantial changes, probably more the intricate part where there's a bit more contention around it, is, what happens when you submit a substantial change to Scarlett? So the way that we work is we've got this change notification triage form or change notification form within the workspace. You fill that in, give us the information about what your change is. We then take that and we triage it and we give an outcome. I'll go through some of the outcomes that you can expect from us. The first one is actually immediate approval. There's sometimes we get change requests where we don't actually need to do anything. It's within the scope of their certificate. There's no real safety or performance concerns. There's no changes to intended purpose, and we can pretty much give an immediate approval. The other swift resolution we can get is reissuing of an updated certificate. So I'll talk a bit about adding new devices to an existing certificate a little later on, but that's a good example of a case where if you have a number of devices within a product group and we've already assessed a number of them, if you're adding another device to that group, sometimes we can just let that through without an assessment and just issue an updated certificate to show that device is now certified. When we get into changes that really impact, let's say, intended purpose, impact safety and performance, maybe there's a big redesign of your device, we can then look to do a sort of focused partial assessment to just put our mind at ease and make sure that we are guaranteed, or not guaranteed, we're confident that this device is going to be safe when it goes out into the world. The final one is a full reassessment. This is more common when you get up to class 3 medical devices. For class 2A and class 2B, we don't really see the full reassessment being a pathway that's taken by us, really, to be honest. So the summation of that really is to just give you an idea that just because you've got a substantial change doesn't mean that the workload that's going to be put in by the notified body is always going to be very, very time consuming or very, very, very laborsome. So, do have confidence that you can push substantial change to us and expect you will get approval on it relatively quickly. Another aspect is, as Liam was talking about earlier, is predetermined change control plans. For anyone who's not overly familiar with them, these are sort of prospective plans that allow a manufacturer to describe future modifications to an AI or ML enabled device. And this was introduced by the FDA. It's been around for a number of years now. I think they started talking about it 2019 or so, but it was formalized in 2023. So it's been, on the US side, manufacturers have been using this for a couple of years. And we're seeing a lot of people asking now, are they able to use within the EU? So there's three main parts to PCCP. First of all, there's the scope. So this is where the manufacturer describes or defines the boundary of the anticipated changes that they want to have within the scope of the piece. The second part then is the modification protocol. So this tells them exactly how would the modifications be implemented. So that includes how they're going to get the data that needs to retrain the algorithm, how they actually go about revalidating the algorithm, how they go about deploying that to production. And then finally is the assessment of the risks. So what the PCCP is doing is essentially moving all of this early in the process and making sure you're assessing the risk front. So you before you make the changes, you outline what risks would be associated with these changes and how you either are already mitigating these within your software or how you're planning to do so along with the change you're making. So then once that plan has been produced, it's usually produced either at the initial submission or before any changes are made after the submission. So the regulator approves that plan. That then, in the FDA, it removes the need for approval beyond the point of release. I'll put in there reduce, and I'll tell you why in a second. The reason for that is we're actually currently undertaking a pilot on the use of PCCP within EU MDR. So there's one or two customers who we're on that journey with at the moment. This pilot is really driven by a demand from our customers to see how we can integrate this into our processes and make it available. So the way we're doing it at the moment, and this is potentially how it could look if the pilot is successful and we consider it to be worthwhile. Essentially, you take the same diagram we had. The difference here is that if you have a substantial change, there's two pathways. So if you have a substantial change that's within the scope of the approved C, what you can do then is you implement the change. Where we differ from the FDA and the way we're running the pilot is we still require that sort of notification before it gets released to the market. But really, because we've already approved the PCCP beforehand, that's really just an authorization check to make sure what you've said you're going to do is matched what you've actually done. So we aim to try and get that back within 1 day within the pilot. So that's just a look at the way the pilot is running at the moment. It's potentially the way it could work. As Leon said, obviously there's changes coming up in the end proposal. So again, that would modify things potentially again. The other question we get asked a lot at the moment is what does it look like when I want to add a new device to an existing product range? So for a number of our customers, they've got certification with us for Class 2A or Class 2B software as a medical device. They might be operating in a particular area, let's say radiology, and they want to add a new device in the same space to their certificate. So the way that's working at the moment is what we do is we've got a device sampling plan for our technical assessments. And that means essentially that we don't, for Class 2A and Class 2B, we don't check every single device that comes through. We don't assess it. What we have is depending on the device category and the device group, we have sort of a scaling factor. We will look at X out of Y devices across the year, and again another level of review during the surveillance period of 3 years or 5 years. And so the way that works then is when you submit your change notification form, you tell us this is a new device. Here's the description of the device. We think it falls within our existing product category, and we'll go down and triage that. If we find that it is within the same product range, one of the outcomes is if there is an impact to our device sampling plan, so you've added more devices than we've assessed, or we hit that threshold where we need to assess another device, we will then may trigger a partial or full technical assessment. And also if we've got very specific safety or performance concerns about the new device, we may also trigger again a partial or full assessment. Again, usually we find we're either just going on the partial route in most cases. If it doesn't impact the device sampling plan, or we haven't got very specific concerns about the safety or performance, then there's no delay. We just update the certificate, as I was talking about earlier, and we reissue to that. So it is quite quick in a majority of cases to be able to add a new device to your existing product range. That's basically the talk. So what I've talked about there really is how you should set up your initial submission to define how you're going to manage your changes. Make sure that is concrete, and really make sure it's reflective of how you're actually going to do the work, because essentially when we come to the audit, we're going to check back against that. Have a robust process for categorizing those changes as substantial and not substantial, because again, when it comes to the audit, you're going to have to defend the rationale for that. Make sure that the evidence you've gathered through your change management process is readily available for audits, because that is again something we will be looking at. And then finally, I think just one of the things I would say is to make sure you engage proactively with the notified body. We are there to help. Our goals are aligned with yours. We want to make sure we're accelerating healthcare advancements to market as soon as we can. So the more you can be proactive in your engagement with us regards to changes, the better we can actually move ourselves internally to support your needs. And finally, the big takeaway I want to give is that just be encouraged to be able to iteratively deploy SaMD changes. One of the things that we're noticing is that, especially people who've been in the game quite a while, they're still worried about the regulatory overhead of any sort of change that they make. And we're seeing people or manufacturers who are either trying to front load all of the development and take a long time to get to market because they're trying to fit every feature in because they're scared the changes are going to take a long time. Or the other problem we've seen is that manufacturers are actually just not being as venturous or as innovative as they can be, because they know that for every new piece that they add, it comes with a lot of regulatory burden. So what we're trying to do, especially early on in our processes, is really encourage manufacturers that you can be adventurous, you can move fast, and that the regulatory burden isn't as big as it maybe is with some other notified bodies or in previous times. And hopefully, with the changes to new proposals coming up, some of this will get easier again. What I'll do then, just to finish off, is I'll give you a quick demo of the process of how in our system you are actually able to raise a change request. Let me just pull this over. So this is our system here. It's a very simple web app. This is our demo workspace. Helix AI, who's a fictitious company, has got a couple of medical devices on the market. If you go in under change notifications, you come up to this sort of screen here, and I'll run you through the form first. So if you want to add a new change notification, it's just a matter of clicking the button and then you fill in your form. So this is just the title of the change, the description, giving us a brief description of exactly what it is you're changing. And then essentially underneath, we've got a selection of boxes that you can select. So you can tell us whether it's specific to a device you already have. We can drop into whether you think it's changing an existing certificate that you have, whether it's a QMS change, whether it's a new device inside or outside the scope, and further down, device changes, maybe a change to the device name or the UDI. And then here's where the more detail comes in, is how the intended purpose of the device is changing. Is there any changes to safety and performance of the software? And then as well at the bottom, you can actually drag and drop files in that help provide clarification on exactly what it is you've changed. So if I just delete that for a second and show you some of the ones that the guys have built into the product already. So here's an example one that's filled in for a new device, which is going to be, if I scroll down, the manufacturer saying this is within the existing scope of the certificate, and they've uploaded the technical documentation related to this device. So when this gets sent to Scarlett, this is the kind of thing that we see then. And that then gives us an idea that we can go and check, well, do we agree if this is in the scope of the existing certificate? And then we can make our trade process from there. And just to give you another similar example, here's a change to an existing device that's adding a new report generation and also expanding the scope of their AI device to take in another disease. And again, so there's a lot of information that's filled out related to this. So the idea here is what should happen here is when you submit this to Scarlett, essentially we get it as in a little chat window, and actually we can have a straightforward conversation with you straight off the bat. So there's no waiting around. It's very much, especially if we know the change is coming, we can jump straight on this. We can ask for additional information. This one, it's uploading, and can you upload the risk management report, and that'll give us more information for our triage. And then hopefully in this scenario we can say, look, we don't need to do another partial assessment. We can go to market and we can reissue a certificate. So we're trying to make this sort of as very straightforward and as as open communication as possible and as transparent and quick, to be honest, more than anything else. But yeah, that's the demo of the app. And if there's any questions, just let me know.
I'm really excited in seeing your system and seeing how people can actually report changes. That's the first comment I'd like to make. And the second one is I really, really am happy to see that you're embracing the option to promote a sampling approach, because I think it's one of the key improvements actually under the MDR that was made when compared to the MDD, is allowing manufacturers to at a much lower threshold just introduce new products onto the market. It fits under the scope of the quality management system. So yeah, really, really, really great to see this. Thanks a lot. There are some questions. Well, I actually posed 2 questions, but I could imagine other people might have questions, and I would like to start with the question posed by Deanna. Deanna is asking, they have a different notified body, and I think she's struggling with timelines that she's seeing at her notified body. Is there any official timelines of changes that notified bodies should adhere to in their review?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm actually, off the top of my head, I don't know. I know now there's the new legislation coming in that we have to be very transparent and report figures on how long it's taking us. I think the threshold is quite high at the moment. We're talking of 6
months is acceptable, unfortunately.
So like, yeah, you can see the numbers we're claiming on our website for our sort of average times, or what we find is achievable for changes, and they're much below that number. So yeah, again, it depends a lot on what you're changing. But again, we are trying to be as pragmatic as possible. I think there is an element of, especially if you look at Annex 9 in the orders, notified bodies are very cautious in how they're applying that. They're talking how we can be pragmatic. I know that there's conversations with the notified body coordination group to look at that and see, well, what is the right interpretation and how can we make that a little bit faster and more streamlined for people.
Yeah, and we're having multiple people here, and I would just like to ask, I can imagine that other people might have questions before I pose my questions. So is there anyone who might want to unmute and ask a question? Feel free. No one? Then I'll just continue to my question. Because one thing that drew my attention when you're representing is on the substantial change definition. You mentioned it's up to the manufacturer to determine what they consider a substantial change. But I could imagine that you probably have an opinion as to, when you review a procedure, what you consider a minimal threshold of what should be reported. Is it really entirely up to the manufacturer?
No, I think the regulation puts the burden on the manufacturer, but yes, obviously we have our own sort of interpretation of things. So again, one of the things that we try and put in our process as well is making it very swift to get that decision on whether it's substantial or not. So if you are borderline and you're concerned about it, the best thing to do is actually just submit it to us. And because we've got this live chat thing going on, it's very quick for us to turn that question around. But yeah, I think where we stand on things at the moment is very much, if there's an impact to the intended purpose, if there's an impact potentially to safety and performance, or if it's a major redesign of your device, yeah, we'd like to see that first. We think that should be a conversation we have. So it's better to submit those, and we can then make the decision of, well, actually, no, we've seen enough of your devices in this area, so we're happy. Or actually, no, we want to drill in, let's say, on your clinical data specific to this sort of expansion of your intended population.
Yeah, understood. Agnieszka, you may have a question, may not longer have a question. Feel free to go ahead and ask.
Sorry, I was looking for a mute button. I had a very practical question, because I've seen one of the events from the NoboCup community, where somebody from TÜV presented, because I'm as a manufacturer, I have to produce technical documentation in an acceptable format for a notified body. And I've seen TÜV spoke about using Markdown and some machine-readable formats as something like for us to have a universal standard into how we communicate with notified body. And I was wondering, what's the position of Scarlett, how you see this? Because for the moment, we work with PDF files, this is an Excel spreadsheet, so it's just a ginormous amount of administration. But for the software project that I work on, I've seen actually most of my colleagues, most of developers like Markdown.
Yeah.
Moving this to formats in something that looks pretty. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, we sort of like to meet the customer where they are in terms of submission format. So if you are working a PDF, our system is drag and drop. So you drag and drop what files you want, So if you've got PDFs, we'll take PDFs. What we have in our preferred submission formats within our knowledge base is, narrative documents, have them as PDF or Markdown, or then for more the granular, like this discrete data. So I'm thinking about like your risk management table, your software requirements, your tests, anything that requires traceability. Actually having those as Excel or CSV is actually better because you can parse those better in sort of in a machine language. But I think that is the way. We would definitely be going is towards more Markdown, CSV, JSON data as much as possible, while also allowing people to still work in PDF. So like there's some tools we have internally that when we get in PDF files, we actually pull them out into Markdown to be able to run some AI stuff on them.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Diana? Feel free.
Hi, I have a question, but it's not about the submission to the notified body, because like I already had that experience, but I noticed that maybe, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. So it's not about the submission part or the notified body part, but it's how to do internally the process more efficient. Because we did everything right, like we proved it's substantial, we didn't have any non-conformities in the surveillance audit. So I think the content is right, but the operational efficiency could be better. So do you have any practical tips how to be more agile in the documentation? Thanks.
Interesting. Where do you think was the biggest burden in that within the documentation? Is it within, like, let's say the technical software team, or more on the regulatory side of deciding, what the change is substantial or not?
Well, I think it's neither. It's maybe the way we have some maybe very wordy templates that then we make ourselves our own servants, but then because we say that we have to write that much, then we write that much, but then if there's any way to make more efficient, it was not the decision process, it was not the development process, it was I think the blocker was the documentation part, that it was too bulky.
Interesting. Yeah, one of the things on that, actually, if it's a helpful example, but we've obviously got forms that we're asking people to submit, in terms of either it's like the submission form or it's the change notification form. I always think that if manufacturers are able to use that earlier in the process to try and help them determine what they need to be able to categorize what the change is, and use those forms. They're quite simple to be able to just fill that out and then use that internally as your documentation to try and run through whether you think it's substantial or not, and having your flows within that. But that's one way of looking at things. But yeah, internal trudge is always a problem in most medical device organizations.
I have one more question, and then I would like to move on to the presentation of Monique. And just I'm going to share my screen for 1 second. Here we go. This is actually the text from the AI Act, and I found this rather disappointing, because I think the interplay between the AI Act and the MDR says that this definition also applies to medical devices. And what it says, that substantial modifications mean a change to an AI system after placing it on the market, put into service. And if you're making any changes that are unforeseen as part of the initial conformity assessment, and it could affect compliance with the higher risk AI requirements, it should be considered a modification. Section 2 is affected or results in a modification. That means that you probably need to go back to the nut body. And I think this makes, again, the threshold for reporting changes to the nut body a little bit lower, or higher, whatever way you look at it, compared to what is currently in the MDR. Clear, we are still waiting on some final changes potentially to the AI Act based on the implication process. Do you foresee, Scarlett, is this going to change something in how you approach this, or are you going to expect the manufacturers will go more for predetermined change control plans?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's a difficult one to answer with so much sort of proposals out there.
Yeah, of course. Yep.
They'll need to be aligned. But I think the way we look at things is ideally what we want to do is make sure that our internal processes are aligned to the standards we need to comply with. So let's say the AI Act and the MDR, and then have some sort of pragmatic way of being able to meet the needs of both of those regulations, but also in a way that's going to pragmatically allow our customers to move forward. So I think people will be quite a good lever to have in those places. And the other one as well is looking again at the scope of or the interpretation of Annex 9, and if there is a way that of not having substantial changes for everything that's going to touch the intended purpose, maybe being able to release the bounds on that a little bit. There might be some wiggle room there. Thankfully, we have people within the team who are more smarter and interested in this than I am to wrangle this around.
Yeah, I still don't get my head around this either. It's just the complexity of all the regulations combined that is not really helpful.
Yeah.
Anyway, Stephen, thanks a lot for your willingness to present in these evening hours and giving your perspective from the notified body view. It's really helpful to get the in view from another point from another body, and I truly am excited about the more innovative approach that Scarlett is taking to change management. And I see Diana is also a fan. So thanks for the positive vibes, Diana. I would like to give it over here to Monique so that Monique can also present her side from more practical perspective on change management, more what is currently in the ISO 13485 and how do you practically approach it. You want to take over?
Yeah.
And for those who are not aware, who just recently joined our company, she's with MedQAIR. Monique brings an extensive background from a large medical device manufacturer, and she's led multiple teams, both under the medical device regulations, but also under the in vitro diagnostic regulations. So also thanks a lot for preparing for this session.
Yes, you're welcome. So I want to touch a bit more on what it means for the organization, and because what it means for submitting to notified bodies and what their expectation is well described by Stephen. But then let's go to the one that is important for also to understand. And there I want to first touch on what is actually in the standards and regulation and what their language is in this standards and regulation. And here it is the ISO that we need to work on. This is a part of the quality management system. And if you look at that, it directly indicates the organization shall. And then we have document procedures to control the changes of design and development. And then, of course, determine the significance. That's one of the topics that also Stephen mentioned, related to function, performance, usability, and also applicable regulatory requirements. So, and then identify the changes, what shall be implemented. But before implementation, you need to review, verify, validate as appropriate. Also, I come back to that a bit more, and approve. So the release cycle that you need to go through. But then one other thing is review. What does it actually mean? Evaluation of the effect on what? On all kinds of parts, but also the product. It's so modules, I would say, with software, but product in process, but also what is in the field. So if you have any change that you see that needs to be happening in your product that is under development, there might be a version that's already in the field. So what are you doing with that? Input, output, risk assessment on product realization, and of course, recording. You always need to record everything that you have done and evaluate it, and especially the reason why. That is the ISO. But what would be the next step if you go to the EU MDR or the IVDR? They also include various type of change management activities. So it is about design, but also QMS changes that you need to work on and detect and control. You have also device design and characteristics. There can be changes in, but also harmonized standards. Your economic operators, that there might be a change in that. And if you do clinical investigations, you also need to be careful what to do if there are any modifications to the clinical protocol or to any of the study activities that you do. If you look at significant change triggers, that's also something that the MDR and the IVDR calls out, again, specific to performance, safety, and conditions of use. And then they actually explicitly mention, do you change the frequency of an anticipated risk? Do you call out an unknown risk that you did not see before and that you identified now? So also look at the benefit risk ratio, that is important. So it is really focused also again on risk. But also if you do a limitation on your IFU or conditions of use, you need to check if it affects your GSPR conformity. So there's a couple of things that trigger also in MDR that are very specific mentioned, but in general, it is of course a design change of your product. So let's go to the next slide, because then I want to talk a bit more about what product changes are. And we call out defects. And most of the time within the software area, we focus on bugs, but are not always defects. So what are you calling defects? So that is a definition that is important that you have included in your process and in your assessment how you see changes. Defects can be from internal and external source, and defects normally mean that you do not meet your requirements that you set. They are often called bugs, but bugs are small. Defects, if you look at defects and it's an external source, you have a product in the field, then also it's important to look at if the release product is impacted. So do you have a complaint? What is the impact? Is it on safety, performance? Is it an adverse event? A reporting needs to happen, or containment? Do you have a field safety corrective action? So defects can be quite impactful also when you are actually having a defect mentioned from internal. So be aware of that. That is a different way to look at it. Cybersecurity issue might be an urgency there, because you don't want to have your product as a vulnerability and you need to respond there. So that is most of the time very urgently worked on, with patch releases. Next to that, you can have changes that are related to enhancements or feature requests. Enhancements are for me small and do not touch, for instance, the performance. Significantly, it's not a significant change. Feature request can be significant, but also can be not significant if this doesn't touch a high risk situation, or it doesn't bring something that is influencing the risk or performance of your device. So also there you need to really think through what is I'm actually doing with the different type of changes that I can bring to a product. Then I would like to continue with the process itself. So managing product changes is actually your design control. You design change control in this way. So again, evaluate and assess. So what is the change request actually about? That's one of the things that I also indicated in the previous slide. Be known, be careful, be also looking what is the change request talking about. It's the bug, it's the defect, is it external, is it only an enhancement, is it a feature request, is it a wish from a customer for certain features that you are actually not planning to do, but make sure that you identify what is the change request about, and what is the reason to work on it and to actually implement it, if it is indeed necessary, or is it useful, or it is a preference. That's something to think about from an organization point of view, what you want to do with it. But of course, impact assessment is part of that then, and your risk assessment is part of the initial evaluation and assessment. But you need to understand all these topics before you actually want to commit and start working on a change. Part of development is updating your requirements if needed, updating verification and validation. So that's a planning activity too for your design and development, and then your execution. Validation, also you need to check if it has impact on your validation evidence, but that depends of course on the type of change you're trying to bring in. Design review is always part of this cycle also to conclude that you have done and touch everything that is needed for the change to be implemented. So, and do it iteratively. If you are making changes and if there is a failure, then go again. That's actually normal software development practices. So I would not expect that would be different from or a surprise for everyone. So, but you need to approve and implement and release it. So there is also some administrative type of things that you need to control. So there needs to be approval. You need to have to document your updates carefully, as also indicated by Stephen, why it's necessary. And also before implementation and post-implementation, you check if everything is working as expected. So that is a controlled release, and confirm that indeed the intent of that change is indeed met. Important to not forget the last one. So now I'm going back to what is seen as regulatory significance, the triage from an organization point of view. So when do I need to go to a regulatory submission, and what would be probably not needing a submission. However, if you have a non-significant change, as was also explained, this will be identified and part of a surveillance audit to check if that is following the process still. So what is important to and what will be a significant change? If you have a change in your clinical intent, so that means expanding patient population, a new clinical condition, or a new risk classification. That's even a very big change, of course. Also changing your algorithm, so the operating principles, the core code logic, and how data is analyzed, processed, or presented. I think that is very impactful changes if you're going to do that. So with that, it's of course a regulatory submission. Also operating systems that you are using and your network architecture, if there are major changes into that, also because that's depending on how the product can work and what the influence will, and also the interoperability, but the fundamental network of and the architectural structure. If there is any change in that, make sure that you discuss that with your notified body or FDA. User interface data presentation. Also there is an interesting one. Maybe there is a lot of tweaking and improving user interfaces, but be aware if changes are influencing your performance or influencing anything you have done within validation or usability, you need to make sure that you check that, and that by the user is still sufficiently good, and that you actually are not changing the product too much. So that are still items to really look into, and if that is that's often user interfaces overlooked. I experienced that. Yeah, and then non-significant change, structural bug fixing that is not impacting, is correcting code defects that have not intended to alter the function itself or has a major implication. Security patches is normally also not being seen as need approval by notified body. It's important to do that, and also make sure that that is not impacting your functionality or your intended use, but still it needs to be performed. Performance optimization, and that is not something about clinical performance or performance of about speed, memory, all kinds of underlying efficiency improvements. That is normally not seen as a non-significant change. I want to make one comment to this. You can have a lot of non-significant changes, but be aware if you build your product and you update your product regularly, it can be some of a cumulative situation that there are so many changes that you would be wise to actually do a resubmission and make sure that it is captured and well assessed also with notified body how much that this change actually changes your product from your previous version. So don't overlook that if you have a lot of minor or non-significant changes. In addition to what I've told about product, I want to make sure that we also from an organization point of view, you need to manage many other changes carefully. And that is not only related to software development, but also to organization and the legal entity, for instance. I've been in organizations that want to change legal entity or QMS certificates or whatever very easily, that is not an easy trajectory to go to. So be careful also to what you want to change and how you want to move this change. Also, responsible persons in UK, but also in authorized representatives, that are people that are, if you're going to change these things, it's something that you need to think carefully about. Also about mergers or acquisition, restructuring, very organizational wise things, but also can impact the QMS certificate and also the audit that is required for actually providing all the legal certificates there. Change of notified body, we talked about that. There's also a major change for your organization to handle. It's not a major change from the product perspective, probably, but definitely for your organization. You have quality management system changes you need to look at, but also don't forget regulatory and compliance. New standards, we have just talked about it. There are so many things moving at this moment, standards, regulations, but be aware of what is changing and how it impacts your product that is under development, but also what is in the field. Supply chain and third party needs also to be looked into. Who is your hosting provider? Is there any changes they are making? Make sure you have good contracts with them. Also, making sure that your product can be delivered on their platform, and you are not surprised with any hiccups there. It does happen. So be aware of that. And of personnel, I won't touch that. I think everyone is aware of there can be implications with changes in your organization, but that's not a regulatory item. But for all, control change, because that will enable innovation and that will protect patients. I think that's the most important thing to look at. And if you have uncontrolled change today, that will lead to many problems tomorrow. So be careful how you do things. It doesn't need to be overcomplicated, but you need to be conscious of what the change is and what the impact of this change is, and handle it carefully.
Thanks a lot. I guess that's your last slide.
Yes.
So thanks. And we do have two questions. I'd like to go to them in a second. One story I can share. And I think we had the same discussion this afternoon, and I think it touches me personally, is where you mentioned that think about the cumulative part of very minor, non-substantial changes.
Yeah.
At the organization I worked for, we had developers that what we defined in our procedures. If you're doing refactoring, it doesn't change your requirements. It doesn't affect verification and validation testing consequently. And then I had developers coming to my desk saying, we're just going to refactor a very minor part of the software. This is not going to be a problem. We can just push it through to some retrospective testing and it won't be, we can just release it outside of the procedures. And then before I knew it, the software development team was pushing a little bit of refactoring, which together became a lot of refactoring, almost entirely the whole change of the code base, just in an effort to simplify the code. And then what happened is they didn't run the verification and validation testing. Consequently, there was a bug in there that affected patient safety, and we had to do a recall. So it's definitely one that should not be overlooked. I learned and found out the hard way, where you get too much freedom to your development team to have freedom in the procedures to actually make very tiny changes without having to go through the rigor of verification and validation testing. Be aware that for anyone here, that can affect actually the safety and performance of the product, and probably should be considered and tested a little bit more rigorously than just saying, we'll just do our testing, unit testing.
I recognize that, and that's also very important to have a close contact with your technicians and actually ensure that your engineers understand the implication of certain changes, because they are often not aware, and they are often also not how I say it, more sensitive to other things than to these type of things. So
what happens a lot?
It's a simple change, but that doesn't mean that the total burden is not impacted. Yeah.
And what you see happening a lot, right? Organizations, especially when in startups, you want to get the best engineers, and the best engineers are not always coming from the medical space. So you get engineers here and there, not coming from the same level of regulated industries. You pull them together,
Yeah.
They are just seeing additional unit testing, verification testing, validation testing. It scares them off. It feels like a big slowdown to the organization in their view. And they're just going to try to, well, I don't think this actually needs to go through the change procedures. And
but it's very important that part of that they often do also their risk assessment, which they often miss the point of certain risk from clinical perspective and overdo them from a technical perspective that doesn't have any meaning from a clinical perspective. So that balancing, it's important that part of your risk assessment activities, a clinical related person or a regulated person should be involved to actually challenge and also discuss what the risk is actually of the product, because it's sometimes very overcomplicated and in other areas underestimated. And that's a problem that I see with smaller organizations, but even in bigger organizations, it's the same.
And there's two questions. One question that came back from Diana, which relates on risk-based approach. And her question is, and maybe you want to call it out yourself, Diana? Okay, so the question from Diana's end is, in terms of risk-based approach, how do you do an effective risk-based approach on the QMS itself? And if you have any tips for this? Because risk-based approach towards, I guess our intention is towards changes on the management system, but it's also just risk-based approach into the quality system.
Yeah, so if you do, you need to know what type of products you are working on and what are the critical parts of those products and how you position it in the field. And with that, what is actually the boundary also from the product? Not only look at your software product as a standalone, but also the boundary, the network that it's going to handle in, and what type of information that's going to be shared, or what the output actually of your software products, and how that is positioned within the clinical workflow. That is important. Then you know that if that is settled, or risk characteristics, I would say, then you also can determine how much rigor you need to do with verification, how much rigor you have with documentation, how much rigor you need to do with validation. Is it still possible to use only non-clinical data because you have a lower class a product that doesn't affect actually the patient diagnostic part? So that's where you need to look at the risk base. What is the scope of your development activities? What is the scope of your business that needs to adhere to certain requirements in the from a quality management perspective, but also from a product perspective? And then you're going to build your quality system around that understanding.
I think the second question touches a bit more on my example, but then exactly the other way around. So let's say there's a software application in the field, and there's an urgent security patch that must be rolled out, or a safety patch potentially, because there's an issue within the software. How would you get that patch out in the field as soon as possible to fix something that is broken and can potentially affect security and safety, whilst understanding that pushing the patch through might by itself affect safety and performance of the device? How can you prioritize? What do you prioritize? Quick release to address an urgent issue in the field, and maybe skip a little bit on the verification and validation tests versus going through your validation and verification test cases through the full extent, realizing there's an issue in the field.
Also there, you need to understand what the criticality is for the patient in the end. That's what you need to assess again and again in each of these situations. If the patient can be impacted on a short notice with these type of issues, then you need to act, or you need to contain. What I would say, you need to contain the issue, stop the bleeding. That's what you actually need to do as fast as possible if there is a high risk for the patient. You need to discuss with your users how to use your product. If that is not the case, then you still need to rationalize that. And actually, I would definitely discuss this with the competent authority at hand, what to and start reporting, because then it can be a combined decision. What would be the preference here?
So what you're saying is that in some cases it might be worthwhile pushing a fast patch out to address a security issue or safety issue without going to the full rigor of the full validation and validation test cycle.
Yeah, if
If
it is really hurtful and issue for patient safety, you need to act.
Are there any other questions that people would like to ask? Anyone? Feel free, now's the chance. No, then I'm going to switch to my own presentation. I would have liked an industry speaker. We invited actually two. One unfortunately had to cancel last minute. So I decided to take over myself in the absence of our speaker. Sorry for that. I would have loved to someone actively working in the field right now and going through these type of changes. What I decided is not to touch a little bit on a very specific part of change management, which is around the UDI and how changes can actually affect the UDI system. And it's something that touches me personally as well, because it's, for me, one of the aspects in the MDR where you can truly see that people who have written the MDR do not understand software. So it frustrates me. If you look at 20, I'm not sure how many people have seen this in Annex 6 of the MDR Part C 6.5, there's an explanation of how UDI relates to software. And you'll see that they use the definition of minor changes and patch releases. And then the weird part is where in 653, they go into minor software revisions. And then under minor software revisions, they include security patches and items that are implemented like bug fixes that do not affect the requirements of the software, which is just incorrect. This doesn't make sense. So to me, having a minor software release does actually change your software and actually does have implications on the requirements or implications on the risks for the fair and validation testing. Whereas a patch, by definition, should not alter any of the specifications, but bring this software back into the specification. And the problem that this creates, how they've written this down in the MDR, is that you're not going to see a unified way of how manufacturers actually implement these requirements into their procedures. And it's also one of the issues that I ran into when I was still working at my previous organization. We took this very literally, and we actually changed the way the MDR was written. We took our procedure, we said, no, we don't agree with what it says in the MDR. To us, a minor change is always by definition requiring a new UDI/DI. And the patch never has an influence on the UDI/DI. It's very clearly traceable when you have a minor change. You just upload and you sign off on a new declaration of conformity, because in our view, you make changes to the device, you change requirements, you potentially introduce risks, you do new verification validation testing, whereas for a patch, you do not. And we had that discussion with them quite a couple of times, and it was always agreed that our procedure was in principle okay, but slightly misaligned with the MDR. I'm not sure how Scarlett would look at this. Maybe Stephen, at the end, you want to say something about this? But it was something where I just struggled with when I was still at Aidens. So a little bit about basic UDI and UDI/DI and UDI/PI. So the basic UDI is basically the device model or family. So it's very high level, it's very broad. It doesn't typically change when you make changes to the device. Whereas UDI/DI is a little bit more specific towards a version of a product which actually has the same essential characteristics. And that's where there's like a middle layer introduced into the MDR that I personally don't like, because it's making the procedures unnecessarily complex in my view. And then you have the UDI/PI, which is the production identifier, which should be representative of each unit that is developed. And the very simple explanation here is you run a production batch. You have one batch all created and produced under the same manufacturing specifications. You get that one batch number. That is your UDI/PI. The next manufacturing batch is the next one. The next one is the next one. And in software, that translates, in my view, really well with the patch version, which I'll touch on in a few seconds. So I already explained on the first slide, right? You have your basic UDI/DI, which just represents the device family. It should almost never change. Basically, that stays the same all the time. And also here, we took a little bit of a different perspective from how we saw this at my previous company. We thought the basic UDI/DI does change in the event that you're creating a new major version of the software. Why? You're either touching the intended purpose or the certificate. So we put the basic UDI/DI at the same level of the certificate. So when your device changes at that level where there's an implication on the certificate, you get a new certificate, and the new certificate accidentally new basic UDI. Again, this is a point for discussion. And if you read the MDR and how I see now that other companies interpret it, now that I'm a consultant and I see more organizations, I see that we were quite on the strict side, and I don't see the same interpretation. And I see other organizations taking a different approaches, where their base UDI never changes. And then on the level of the UDI, that actually changed more often. And they're actually setting out a number of examples. And they say specifically modifications that change the original performance, the safety or intended use, or the interpretation of data should be requiring a new UDI. To me, again, that sounds very much towards what a minor change for a device is. So not the head levels or not the major level, but the minor level. So it's the middle character. And if you change that, just issue a new UDI. But again, this is not how it's written in the MDR. And this is where it creates some kind of complexity where you could have this middle layer where some of the minor changes will, according to MDR, be seen as patches, where other changes will be seen as UDI changes and more the minor level changes. So there's a misalignment. And ultimately, I think if you look at the MDR, I think for the actual new releases, I think that is a little bit clearer where they say every single new release that you make is always a new UDI API. So that to me is just directly one-on-one linked to the release of a patch. Now, again, I think this is poorly aligned with actual software manufacturing practices. So if you consider this, to me, every single release that you do with the software should just automatically get an update to the UDI API number. It actually says here the release identifier recorded in UDI. That is actually incorrect. You do not upload the UDI in, the UDI PI in. I just thought it's worth to call a little bit out my experiences with the different suppliers of the UDI details. And what I find interesting is that I see in Europe a lot of organizations choosing for GS1 because it's just a simple one that everyone has simple access to. And my organization, we chose for HTC. And what I found also interesting is that with GS1, every time you create new packages of UDIs, you need to buy them from GS1, which I think is honestly a little bit insane. You pay just for the generation of numbers. Whereas HIBCC, you just pay once for your LIC, and then every new UDI API you create or UDI you create, it's just an automated algorithm. And you just get in a calculator and you put in what your new version number is, and it will just automatically create you a UDI, and you don't have to pay any additional money. So it's a little bit more investment upfront, but then in the future you can create numbers until the end of days, which is all included in the price, which I really like about HIBCC. And to be fair, I think between GS1 and HIBCC has slightly lower coverage on a global scale as to where you can go live with a UDI under their system compared to G1. I have not seen the ICC BBA or the IFA being used in practice. I know the IFA is a German-related one. I wouldn't know why you would choose one for the local market in Germany only, but there might be interest for it. And it should be recognized on the EU-wide level. Now, I think if you look at the actual semantic versioning from a software perspective, how that is intended is for major changes, it's a breaking change. So that means that you're pushing a new release and it cannot be rolled back into the prior version because it's just an entirely new point of software. Minor new capabilities and patches are just bug fixes and security. And this is again where I think that this is not aligned with the MDR, unfortunately, because it would have been a nice opportunity for actually legislators to show that they understand software, which to me, they don't. The last part, again, this is a little bit more into the detail indeed of what that means. So patches are indeed the last number, minor is the one in the middle, major is the first one. And this is exactly in the minor one is where I think it creates confusion, where for some minors, you might need to have a new UDI, for others, you might not. And at Aidens, we took just a simple approach. Basic UDI, every major release, we do a new basic UDI. For a minor, we'll just always create a new UDI. And for patches, we'll just create we don't do a new UDI PI, well, only a new UDI PI, but we don't update UDI because only the UDI DI goes into UDAMED. However, if you want to avoid having to do a lot of registrations in UDAMED, you can create a separate layer where in your minor change procedures, you're evaluating, hey, is this one of the changes according to the MDR that should be seen as a change that impacts the registration? And then potentially only a part of your minor changes need to be given a new UDI DI. I don't think it's the clearest way to do it, but it might reduce the number of UDI registrations in UDAMED. Finally, I think this has already been mentioned by both Monique and Stephen, but you have your patches, which are lightweight, maybe it changes as some basic regression testing and released through the standard pipeline, where minor changes, you would expect a larger change impact assessment, where you review what the performance, safety, and intended use changes potentially are. And also the interpretation, well, the data interpretation should be explicitly assessed, but also the fair validation scope should be reviewed. And in my view, you get a new UDI DI with a new DOC attached, or potentially a UDI PI if you think that it doesn't affect the UDI DI, which still, again, I find that really weird. And then the major part is the full, obviously, following the new full software development lifecycle with all documentation attached to it, which to me would, well, according to MDR, would require a UDI DI, but in my view, a basic UDI DI might make sense. Anyway, my story here is make sure that your procedures align with how you feel this makes sense to your organization and explain it properly to the notified body. And if you don't want to cause confusion and you want to take a very simple approach, I would recommend the approach we've taken at Aidens, but it might require you to push more updates into you. Yeah, I think this is just more of a repetition of what I just mentioned. So that was it for my end. I'll keep it short and simple, I guess. If there's any questions on this part, feel free to ask. Anyone? Also truly interested in hearing other people's stories and how they deal with this and how they consider the UDI DI and where they put the threshold as to whether they want to change it. Maybe we heard you before. How do you view this? If you want to say something about it.
I think in the projects where I worked on, we had very similar, we kind of arrived by convergent evolution to the same system as you had mentioned. The current company where I work in is a bit different because we have a hardware product with the software components. So there you also have an additional complexity of, which units, how do you number them, and they all have independent life cycle. So I don't know if anybody here in the meeting is also in the situation, but sometimes you have different software modules, especially if you have the visualizations, the connectivity, the machine learning for data interpretation. So each of them might have their own life cycle. And that also makes additional complexity. How do you track them all? And if you update only one small component, does this affect the UDI DI of the whole?
Yeah, to be fair, it's a bit of a complex and
it's a big device then also. So you have multiple options to choose when you go to the market. Is that the situation?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that makes it very complex.
Stephen, can you say something about what you see coming from manufacturers and what your expectations are from a perspective, or is it what the manufacturer defines in their procedures?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the latter, is what way you've defined it. I think, the lens I have is more on, let's say, the technical assessments and the changes we have coming through, which will obviously be substantial. So there's usually an update then to the UDDI, the IDI. So the thing we see probably most commonly there is it's just forgotten to be updated. That's within the rush of trying to get a release prepared. They forgot to change it. So yeah, that's one of the things we try and flag early when we get a change on. I'm not too sure now when we look to, let's say, on the audit side on the non-substantial changes. I'm not too sure how prudent our assessors are about that. I think that's where more falls back on, well, what's your processes and are you adhering to them really?
And Monique, when I was telling you about how we did this just now in Aidens, I saw you're shaking your head like, no, that's not the way to do it.
No. If you have your module that's on device level, and actually all other changes are on the second level.
Yeah, so you have that intermediate level change then. So you have major changes, which require a new UDI DI. Then you have minor changes where they may require a new UDI DI. and minor changes that do not require a new UDI/DI, but will require a UDI/PI, and patches always require UDI/PI.
Yes. Yeah, but actually the minor and the major changes sit most of the time, and depends on how the release was. We try to actually to do that as minimum as possible, those changes, and combine it as much as possible to make it not too complex in certain areas. But the module stayed the module.
Is there anyone else who might feel willing to share their example of what they see in the field, or has any practical advice on how to do this? Anyone? No, you can feel free to share your experience, or maybe later.
So what I would like to understand, if you have a configurable product with multiple components and different, are you actually made them separate medical devices that can work together and are interoperable with each other? Or did you combine it to one device, and with that having actually an overarching configuration management activity there?
Yeah, so it was a kind of a mix of both, because there was a configuration where, so we work with something like, it's a kit, but it doesn't know this concept. So you have something that is kind of consists components which you can match based on the specific patient population. Mm-hmm. But then you also have other components that are so actually, well, within the kit, the subcomponents are all part of one device, but then in order to function, they also need to connect to other devices which were manufactured by us, but not necessarily. So each of them also would come with their own UDI/DI and basic UDI, or if they come from the manufacturer.
Yeah. Okay. In complex configuration management.
I'm not a fan, didn't really like it. I can tell you.
And it's weird, right? I mean, it's the simple. You would imagine if you would design a UDI/DI system and UDI/PI system, that it wouldn't have to be complex per se. But then you start understanding that medical devices have so many shapes and varieties that there's almost no other option, that it ultimately does become complex. And it's not. And it's still a little bit open to interpretation on how manufacturers do it and how you assess what is part of the device, what is not part of the device. Is it an accessory? Is it non-accessory? Does it come in a combined packaging? Does it come in separate packaging?
It's also on the other side, you also have, especially if you supply to hospital, they also have their own procurement system. So what they invoice, it has to somehow match with the codes, with the procedures they do. So it's really, I'll say, healthcare is not like a one-off, because I think a lot of MDR is just written with this idea. It's a syringe, it's catalog number, and you can have 1 or 20 in the same package, and then that system, UDI system works very well, but not everything. So it's actually, most devices are much more complex because you have reusable parts, things you can replace, you have accessories, which is another complex topic. Like, you have some that you manufacture yourself, maybe they are unique to only your device, maybe it's something that is interchangeable with other systems.
Have multiple options. That makes it always fun, I believe. Difficult. But...
And ultimately, I think I had one item that I wanted to share is the text that's in the MDR IVDR simplification proposal on the predetermined change control plan. And I just looked up what it actually says in the proposal, and I find it slightly disappointing because it gives absolutely no detail. It just tells you where appropriate, notify body and manufacturer on the predetermined change control plan, enabling the manufacturer to implement changes in the plan. For those who have not looked into what predetermined changes mean, and I think, Stephen, you touched on it, I think there's quite extensive guidance already from the FDA. And what I've seen is also that IVDR has prepared the guidance document. I'm not sure if it's still in draft stage or already published, but I would expect that we get a European MDCG that's probably going to be a derivative of the IVDR framework. And that will probably provide more explanations. And I think what is crucial to understand is that I think you will see two types of predetermined changes, where one type is where you see a change that you're going to make as a manufacturer, which is going to be a one-off change that you can describe in predetermined change control plan, but especially on the end of AI ML devices, where you can set boundaries and then you can make iterative changes under the same change control plan, as long as the change is staying within the boundaries that are predefined by the manufacturer. So you will have like more static predetermined change control plans, but also more continuous change control plans? Go ahead.
I work with in startups, so I found this actually whole concept quite attractive because oftentimes you have limited funding and resources, so what you try to get on the market first will be a very small, say, as light as possible, with as, say, hassle-free and as low as risk class as possible. But usually companies have already, once they embark on this journey, they have already planned for, if we have a second and third funding round, if we had attract more capital, we already know what we are going to do within 3, 4, 5 years ahead, but we just do not have the resources. But if we cannot put the product on the market with CE marking now, then it's game over. So in this niche, I think I really like the concept because it kind of forces people to plan ahead and makes it also worth it to plan.
The only thing I don't understand, and I think touching on this presentation as well by Stephen, right? And this is where I still struggle a lot with what the MDR in this concept. Let's say you bring a new device onto the market and it fits within the scope of the device range that is on the certificate. You can potentially just submit technical documentation with a description and a DOC. You get a new certificate, you bring it on the market immediately, which is one way to do this. But then on the other end, with predetermined changes, you need to do a whole predetermined change control plan. You need to liaise with it, with the body. The notified body might actually push back on it. You get a lengthy discussion. It could delay your initial submission. Whereas then you create a second product, you submit it, and you can go onto the market. It seems like a little bit of a hassle than to actually go for the initial predetermined change control plan if the device or the change you're intending to make could just be a second device that fits within the device range that's on your certificate, where the notified body has much fewer room to discuss with you whether it's on the contents of such a change.
Yeah, it's very interesting that. You can nearly have some game system where instead of extending my model, let's say I have a model that is in itself a medical device, instead of extending it and having to change the control plan around that, I just create a second model to something different, and then a different device that's in the same category, simpler paths through.
Which doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
But who am I? I'm not designing the regulation. None of us is. But that would be an interesting question to ask the European Commission on how they view that and why they just don't promote more lenient change control mechanisms for changes versus new products.
One of the things we're seeing though as well is one of the reasons that manufacturers want the PCCP is for an extra level of like review and security. So although it might take a little bit more time to send it to notified body, they like the confidence in going, okay, well, the next 4 or 5 changes I've laid out on my plan, my roadmap, have already been pre-approved by my regulator. So that might take a bit of time to create that plan and have the conversation with the notified body and then resolve findings related to the plan. But at least once you know that's done, you've de-risked the pathway. It's not as if in 6 months' time you're going to submit a change request and be hit by a 3-month or 4-month delay that you weren't expecting.
Yeah, absolutely true. So you can build in the certainty before you go onto the market for your future change.
Yeah, is that also something that you can, when you are already on the market and you are more aware of the changes that you want to make, also have such a kind of a discussion with the notified body to create at that point in time a predetermined change control plan?
Yeah, and that's the one thing that, we're only running the pilot. In theory, that if it was we were able to do it, we could offer it to people already on the market. It wouldn't necessarily have to be at the point you submit. So you could submit without the change control plan and then add that later on. Or if you're already got an MDR certificate, you could add that in. It's not just for people who are coming to the market. So that's another interesting potential that it has.
Yeah, because that could help indeed to determine the path forward, the roadmap, and make sure what is possible and what is not possible. Yeah, okay, sounds good.
Are there any other questions from people, or does anyone have a high-pressing need of a topic that we should discuss in the following SaMD meetup? Anyone, just feel free to shout out. Or does anyone have? Go ahead, Sarah.
I don't particularly have a question regarding the topic, but I saw someone started the recording. Is there a way for me to rewatch? Because it has, we touched on a lot of different topics and I would like to go over it again later on as well.
And I'm not sure. Ivo started the recording, and when I logged in, because I had my issues coming into the meeting, I saw that you are actually recording it. Yes. Is there a way that you can share the recording, or is it actually with Ivo? I got lost. But the chat notified me that you are recording.
Is on the button, and I note, but I don't use Loom Notes, so I don't know what it is. But I really apologize. So I'm going to investigate it after the meeting, because I had a trial period for Loom for some time ago, but I don't use it anymore. So I don't know what is.
Okay, then I guess that Ivo started the recording, and we'll make it available online, and it will be shared over, I guess, LinkedIn and through the SAM, over the Open Regulatory Slack and also in the YouTube channel. So follow those and you will see it. Do you also have an idea for an interesting topic for the next one, Sarah? If you have any?
We're just actually starting out with our medical regulatory, so we're learning a bit about everything. So there's lots of new things coming out, new information. So I cannot pinpoint yet one specific topic to go over, because everything is a learning for now.
Good. Diana?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned in the chat or in LinkedIn that a topic for another meetup would be how to be efficient, because the thing is that we could comply with everything in the MDR and the standards and the guidance document, but sometimes it's an overkill, and then the board will never tell you you're doing too much. But then we are overworking in things that are not necessarily important or don't translate into safety. So if it could be a way to be more efficient, that would be a great topic in my opinion.
Diana, if Scarlett is your notes, do you want me to remove them from the meetup so that we can discuss this further? That's just a joke, by the way. I'm not going to promote doing things on record.
No, not for body anyway. So
Lisa, you want to comment? Go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I'm new to these meetings, and sorry if it was discussed, but I think that super interesting topic is process validation in the context of SaMD. So
do you mean like software validation, or more validation of a real process, like the production? No, production might not be the right. So for example, the
validation. This is a part of ISO 13485. I don't remember which section it is, but it talks about the process validation, which obviously could be a sterilization, which is not applicable to SaMD. But what can we define as a process? I know that process validation could be used for processes that cannot be verified, which will be, for example, AI chatbot used in the SaMD that should be validated. So yes, I think it's super interesting. Yep.
So I hear you say two things. One is process validation, which is more, and one process that comes to my mind, for example, is installing software or providing service to software. So how can you validate the installation process so that you don't have to test each and every single validate every time? And the other question I hear you ask is, how do you validate the device itself in terms of clinical validation? How do you validate an AI chatbot, for example, that is used within the boundaries of a medical device? And I think both are two separate questions. And I think they're both equally worth having a discussion about.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Those are great topics. Thanks. We'll make sure to put out a poll again on LinkedIn so people can actually provide their input on what they want to see discussed next time. And we'll invite people for the relevant topic for the next meetup. Also, if anyone in the meetup is interested ever in presenting themselves or giving a presentation on their own experiences, everyone is invited to come forth with an option for a presentation for the next session, because it should be open and it should be available to anyone who wants to present and wants to get a little bit of experience in presenting and interacting with audience. So it's a community by all for all. I don't think there's any additional questions. If there's no one else, or if we don't have any topic left to discuss, then I think we can end the meetup. Or Stephen, do you have anything else you'd like to bring forward?
No, we're good to go, I think.
Okay, then let's round it up a little bit earlier than expected. And nice to see you here, Finn. I was not sure if you were going to come in now that you changed your position, so I'm happy you're here.
I'm here. I was just mostly listening in.
Yeah.
Just listening to our voice. That sounds very lovely. Enjoy your evenings and see you then hopefully during the next SaMD meetup.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.